book of Lamentations is exactly what it is. It's a lament. It's a lament of Jeremiah as he considers the plight of the Jews as they are going into captivity, and to recognize how bad life is going to be and how awful things are. It is a lament. Jeremiah is going to cry out to God. He's going to pray to God several times, and as he does that, he exposes his own desire for the city to be restored, but he also exposes the heart of God and what his plans are. He exposes. It's neat to me that it's in this lament. In the middle of this lament, you have one of the most popular passages for hope found, and that is, I know the plans I have for you, plans to prosper. And that's Jeremiah 20:11. That's the one I'm talking about, is the steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. The mercies are new every morning. Great is his faithfulness. That's really what Jeremiah was relying on to provide for him hope, because if he relied on where the Jews were, he would have been hopeless. If he was relying on his own situation, he would be hopeless. But he doesn't rely on his own situation. He doesn't rely on his own strength or his own power. He relies on the strength and power of God. But in doing so, he's honest about where he is. I love the book of Lamentations because Jeremiah is honest about where he is and laments in the middle of hope. And it's a neat book to see those two falling together and walking together, and how that happens. So Lamentations is written by Jeremiah. All of the historical background, you can just look at what was said for Jeremiah, and you can put that in for Lamentations, because he's writing at the same time. But Jeremiah writes a series of really 5 laments in the book of Lamentations. They don't go chapter by chapter necessarily. But maybe they do. We'll take that back. They do go chapter by chapter in the 5 laments. I thought 4 went longer than it did, but it doesn't. So the first lament of Jeremiah is he laments over the devastation of Jerusalem, the holy city. He looks at the holy city and sees its destruction and recognizes that that's a bad thing. It's the time when the place that God had chosen to make his name known is no longer the place where God is making his name known. So he expresses his own sorrow. In the first part of the first chapter, Jeremiah expresses his own sorrow over the condition of the holy city. But not only does he express his own sorrow, in the second half of chapter 1, he moves into expressing Jerusalem's sorrow itself, as if the city itself is crying out to God in sorrow over what has happened. And this great place, the pinnacle of God's place, is torn down, is devastated by Nebuchadnezzar. So he laments in the first the devastation of Jerusalem. That's really the first lament. But it's interesting to me that he doesn't stop there. He doesn't just stop about how bad he feels. He goes on to explain why God is doing what he's doing. That's the second lament. The second lament really explains, why is God angry? What happened? How did this happen to God's people? If they're really the apple of his eye, if they're really this special nation, what's going on here? And so he explains in chapter 2, he explains the reason for the devastation. He explains what's going on and gives actually the God's perspective on the nation of Israel and why he had to judge them, why he had no choice but to step in and bring this destruction on them. So he shares, first of all, God's perspective, but then he goes on and he shares the perspective of those who are living in the city and the devastation they're facing and the awful situation which they are. There's you can read Josephus and read about the famine that has been in the city when Nebuchadnezzar came and laid siege against. I mean, it's terrible because it's actually prophesied back in Deuteronomy chapter 28, and the consequences of failure to do God's will is spelled out, and it exactly plays out as Moses said it would, with there being siege laid against the city and them effectively eating their own children, and just to stay alive. It's awful what they had done. So we see their perspective in the second half of chapter 2, and then at the end of chapter 2, Jeremiah calls out to God in a prayer, calls out to God again for a prayer for deliverance, and is waiting to hear from God. And that really leads us into the third lament. The third lament is Jeremiah expanding his express of his grief. The first 20 verses are all about hopelessness and distress of chapter 3. And then you get chapter 3, verse 21, and you have this infusion of hope because of the steadfast love of the Lord that never ceases, his mercies that never come to an end. Jeremiah finds hope in those things. And the last section of chapter 3 is because of the distress and the hope. Jeremiah now gives counsel to the people to go to the land and prosper in the land they're going, because they were going to be there for a while. But he gives them counsel and he prays for them again. And it's an extended prayer. It goes from chapter 3, verse 39 to chapter 3, verse 66. It's an extensive prayer that he prays and gives counsel to the people. In the fourth lament, which is chapter 4, God, through Jeremiah, details his wrath. He explains his wrath in detail, and he explains his wrath not just for Jerusalem, but he explains the details of the wrath for Jerusalem and for Edom. Edom is not innocent in all this. It seems like every time, and if you read through the prophets, you can see this actually, when Jerusalem is judged, oftentimes Edom is judged right alongside. I think it's because Edom had the same heritage that Jerusalem did. Esau is the father of Edom, who was the son of Isaac, and should have had a recognition of what God's people should look like. But at the end of chapter 4, there's this brief statement of wrath against Edom. And then we have the fifth lament, which is the prayers of the remnant. God always promises a remnant. He always promises that some will be left. And at chapter 5, you have the remnant. They're going to be remembered by God. For staying faithful, God's going to remember them. For staying faithful, God's going to bless them. For staying faithful, God is going to honor them. You see that same kind of a statement in Malachi at the end of the minor prophets. Malachi makes the same thing for those who are looking forward to God, those who are believing. Here you have that very same thing where there's hope of restoration promised to those, that remnant. And then finally, there's a promise of restoration. And that restoration is found in the last part of chapter 5, the last 4 verses of chapter 5. And really what it does, it explains, I believe, yet still future restoration of Israel, because Israel has not been restored the way it's described in Lamentations yet. So that's what you'll find. It's a really sad book, but it's really full of hope. And so I think the lesson to take from is, even when things are really, really bad, God has not abandoned you people, or us as people, but he's rather fulfilling his perfect word and his perfect purpose. Job says that no purpose of God will be thwarted. Lamentations is exactly that statement. No purpose of God will ever be thwarted. I hope you enjoy your reading of the book of Lamentations.